I must start with gratitude, not just to the audience, but also to the International Institute for Islamic Thought, which brought me back to the annual meeting of the American Academy of Religion. I haven't been a particularly very good citizen of AAR, and I'm glad to come back and be surprised in a way, to see the scope having gotten broader. When I was in graduate school, I had some scandalously broad interests. So I was interested in Hebrew and Jewish law, for example, while I was also wondering why I didn't learn Latin, so I can read something, I can go to the digest of Justinian, for example, and go directly and break down the texts and see where they come from and so on. This is how I was trained to think also of Islamic law. So I wanted to live multiple lives, and I wanted them all also to be when I was in my 20s, when I had all this energy. And when I come back and I see that this is actually, there's a lot of good scholarship there. The diversity, of course, is a theme that will come in my lecture, so it makes sense to acknowledge it first before anything, because I cherish that, and I think the search for coherence sometimes is overestimated, and there is no reason for it. When you realize that the subject is vast, there's no reason to simplify it or minimize it. So I'm glad to come back to the AR annual meeting, glad to see San Antonio was also new for me, and I'm glad to see this new scope. So what I want to do is I want to try to weave two themes today. One is by now, the acceptable condition of despair of the truth and truth systems as an academic goal. Truth systems, to my mind, are not central to scholarship anymore. And the second theme is how the university still preserved standards of evaluation of scholarship. So there's a bit of a paradox there. How can you not be searching for a certain truth, whatever the truth is, philosophical truth, historical truth, whatever it is, maybe religious truth for some people, and yet have standards to judge people and say, this is a good scholar, this is a bad scholar. Now, if what I am providing is an argument, it will look something like this: that the current academic contract doesn't depend on a presumption of neutrality in scholarship or shared global epistemology. They don't depend on that. The university, in fact, depends on an academic due process, which calls for scholars' work to be reviewed, whereby academic institutions can make informed decisions about whom it ought to support and whom it ought to decline to support. This, to me, is a sign of growth and a positive development in our contemporary sense of how academic scholarship should be done. It's a positive sign. Simultaneous with that, though, some old academics, of which we're all familiar, persist, including reproducing fashionable ideas from other academic fields as if they were new and worthy discoveries. And now, this by itself, of course, is not a problem if you really think that there is a reason. I read, for example, about 17th century Russia, and I think, oh, there are a couple of interesting themes. Why don't we think whether this applies to ancient Rome or medieval Egypt or whatever? But if it comes from the lack of hypothesis, the fact that you are not really in touch with your sources, and you're trying to shop for ideas from outside because there aren't enough ideas in your mind, that to me is a problem. Another also is what I call scholarship negation and prevarication, that criticizes but offers no positive assertion. It's gotten to be too much because, and sometimes it comes from good intentions. That, the way we teach our graduate students, you have to be careful. What distinguishes your work from a journalist, for example, is that you can't just make generous assertions. You have to be concise, it's okay to have a limited assertion as long as it is backed by evidence. But at the same time, it gets to be easier for you to say what you don't want to say. And I mean, if you're going to read 200, 300 pages, only to see 17 positions dismantled and nothing at all approximating an assertion, you wonder what you actually did. And there are many problems with that. I'll talk a little bit about that. Other problems too, this fascination or the obsession with the question of what is and what is not anachronistic expression, often coming from people who have really no interest in the pre-modern world, telling us citizenship, state, secular, religious, these don't apply. But you know what also doesn't apply? Teacher, student, most of these things don't mean the same thing. And if you're going to point only to words for which the history is known, you have to be aware your language is about 300 years old, most of the words anyway. So if this amounts to a prohibition about talking about the past at all, as if we're all threatened by the past somehow, that's one thing. But if it comes with the, masquerades in sophistication, to me, it's not a positive thing. There are other problems too, which I think these problems essentially cover up lack of serious questions, lack of interest in the subject at hand. So that would be the thesis, if I were selling a thesis. But I really have something between an argument and a story. And I want to begin from a time when academic faith in certain practices started to weaken. And that is the comparison of cultures and the comparison of religions. I recognize, of course, that comparative religion in a way is done and continues to be done in this gathering. The whole AAR annual meeting is evidence of that. But it is not the same as what used to be accepted in the past, where you make a comparison and you think there is a neutral position somehow. But that turns out to be a very specific religion, Reformed religion, Enlightened religion, liberal religion. And then somehow we started to finally catch this problem and wonder whether this whole exercise is useful. Before one's academic faith in the comparison of religions dwindled, one could still wonder what an Islam-centered view of comparative religion would contribute to the field. Right, so at that time, before we started to doubt even that the procedure is acceptable, one would ask, well, why only that secular modern view of things? Why not take some kind of Islamic neutrality? Right? The Muslim scholars, for example, who embraced Islam and could have gone otherwise, could have stayed with paganism or stayed with Judaism or something like that, were actually neutral in a way. They decided to embrace that religion in some cases. And that wouldn't, so it's not that that would be an invention. We wouldn't coming in the modern world and say, well, let's look for a neutrality centered type of an Islam perspective, in fact. You would find older scholars, from Ali ibn Rabbin al-Tabari to Ibn Hazm al-Qurtuba to Ibn Taymiyyah and other scholars. One will have heard of medieval Muslim voices that took Judaism, paganism, Christianity, among other religious systems, seriously. And with Biruni, one finds interest in India's religious beliefs and practices. So one can go back and ask whether this kind of comparative religion was doable also, or resemble some of the modern ways of doing comparative religion. In many cases, these voices not only clarify aspects of Islam's doctrines and practices by thinking of parallel doctrines and practices of other communities, they have insightful comments about non-Islamic religious beliefs and acts, the so-called advantage of the outsider that Bernard Lewis, for example, mentioned. So you would find sometimes these Muslim scholars saying some interesting things about Hinduism that even Hinduism scholars might be interested in. But in many cases, this, in my judgment, you don't have to share that judgment, these comparisons of religion, even the old ones, were opportunities for venting and polemics. Not consistently, but many cases. So now, the faith that a modern way of doing comparative religion, that would be different, was founded, when all pretensions are abandoned, on the idea that there are global, neutral tools one may employ to do a new kind of comparative religion, whether it's philosophy or history or other tools too, social science, anthropological description, and so on. There was a true faith when it was still working for some people that you would be able to have the same distance. I mean, maybe you would be Christian or post-Christian, but you still believe that you have equal distance from other traditions. Holistic philosophy. So, I mean, of course, the best neutral position vis-a-vis religion from philosophy would be atheism. And everybody here knows that one of the stories that are very important and formative for people who do comparative religion is the story of Heidegger's atheism in particular. Heidegger's stipulation, not just his atheism, but stipulation of atheism. So you have to be an atheist if you really do philosophy. You can't be a religious philosopher. And if you take that approach from philosophy itself, which is a free exercise of search for the truth, and apply it to comparative religion, if it has to satisfy the same goal, then it has to also come from an atheist, right? Heidegger's stipulation that atheism be a condition in the philosopher was one pillar of the new practice. Comparative religion could be done, of course, from a philosophical point of view. Now, it didn't matter that Heidegger's requirement may have been simply a reaction to a very personal frustration emanating from the fact that by the time he was philosophically qualified for the professorship in Catholic philosophy as always craved, he had by then abandoned Catholicism. A very specific story. Why generalize it? Why assume that that would be a good standard for everybody? However, of course, the Heidegger stipulation was seen as a broad point with which one must comply. It may as well be taken as a natural law in the study of religion. Another pillar, if you do religion if you think that the neutrality comes from a historical perspective or a historicist perspective, especially for the history-centered style of comparative religion, was the historicist and neo-empiricist humanities. That's a combination. So you get tools, use the tools of the historian, you look at phenomena that disappear, look at the tools of the anthropologist, describe actual religion. Who's going to argue against this or that kind of evidence? It's all physical evidence. And we all forget, of course, that the one who will use it to specific purposes. Now, this style of studying human beliefs and practices appeal to physical evidence, as we've said. The closest to a natural knowledge type of evidence is one of these weird things about the humanities, always trying to pretend to be something like the natural sciences. And it falls on the spectrum of ridiculous, depending on sometimes the truly ridiculous or the half ridiculous based on that. Because there is something about the phenomena that are studied, of course, by the humanities that make this whole adoption very strange. And when you think about, before I leave this moment of confidence, when people were still, whether based on philosophy or religion or social or history or social science or whatever tools they thought were neutral, there was evidence that the early comparativists were not as neutral. Recently read something by a Dutch scholar, Arie Molendiek is his name, about Max Muller, where he collected some of these things that nobody reads, including his letters and some of the material. And of course, we know that Max Muller, by that time, he was done with his project. He was done also with Christianity, or was almost done. But in the process, it wasn't obvious. This scholar quotes from shifts from a German workshop, where Max Muller says that the study of comparative religion was trying to sell it to his listeners in England. Max Muller, of course, is a German scholar, but he immigrated very young to England and ascended in the ranks all the way until he became a member of Victoria's Privy Council. He was arrogant enough, by the way, to be offered to be knighted, to be made a peer by Victoria, and then he said, well, no, I've gotten better offers from foreign governments if to give me more, so she made him a member of the Privy Council. So he was saying that one of the things that you could do with comparative religion is allow Christianity to be the religion of everyone. So again, it's an interesting thing that this confidence existed at all. So when we celebrate at the end of it, we want to remember. Now, Ismail Faruqi also, and we're still in the moment of confidence, because Ismail Faruqi, whose absence for now 3-4 decades, must be noted, that it is 3 decades, because that makes him both a contemporary of ours and a non-contemporary. 1986, that's fairly recent. A lot of people in this room were adults then. So he must be a contemporary of ours. But also 3 decades is a long time, given these particular 3 decades and all the changes that happened, and including that story I'm telling of the abandonment of a certain style of scholarship and the lack of confidence in modernity. By the way, it's not always the same in all different fields. When I was at Harvard, there's a famous scholar, Harvey Mansfield, who in the 1990s was talking about the end of modernity. He had a sense that, when he's talking about Machiavelli and how Machiavelli brings, in a way, modernity to existence, that by the second half of the 20th century, we're done. The people, the consumers of these ideas of the universals of modernity were beginning to doubt them. So sometimes this stuff takes a while to be assimilated in other fields. When you're totally free, you can actually sort of describe it as you see it, or tell the truth. Now, but Faruqi, I don't want to accuse him of being behind the time or anything like that, because actually what he did, of course, was significant. He clearly wanted the way to universalize comparative religion for him was by taking, or attempting to take, the waspish end. So here I am, I'm going to show you how Muslim scholars also did comparative religion, and they were neutral, and they were reasonable, and they wanted to listen to the Jew and the Zoroastrian and the Christian and so on. And when they discussed history, for example, they would ask, well, where does the Torah come from? What is the Senate that you have? Of course, their standard at the time, the Senate is the only thing that makes sense. You want to know your sources and the sources of your sources. Sounds very neutral. And of course, the Jewish material are very different, all collected in the 5th century BC, and you can't really go back to the Moses story 1,300 years before. All this was a surprise, of course, to the West. So Ismail Faruqi did a big service by bringing all these things to people's attention. He proposed that we take seriously Islam's view of itself as a culmination and development of other religions, as opposed to insisting on viewing it as that subsequent tradition that comes after Judaism and Christianity, right? And also that lags behind the modern, because Islam seems to be in this weird, unique position where its precedence in relation to modernity doesn't benefit it, because it lags behind the modern and it's not as developed, it's not as evolved. But being subsequent to Judaism and Roman law means that it received influences, and that's of course what anybody who moves from another academic world to the Western academic world begins to notice. Like, why does it seem that precedence is an advantage only in one direction? Of course, there are explanations. There are interesting ways to split the hair many times. So Islam remained, in as much as it was sort of a bad version of Christianity. Right? It looks very much like a modern way compared to how medieval Christians would talk about Islam. Medieval Christians thought that Islam is the sum of all heresies. What does that mean? It brings about all these marginal ideas in Christianity, the monophysite type, the thinking and theology and so on, and bring it all, and so it will be a sum of heresies like the Nestorian heresy, the Arian heresy, etc. So I said, no, we'll take it seriously. And he was not alone. W.C. Smith did the same thing. He said, well, how about just take Islam's view of itself? Let's just reflect on that. He didn't go far with that, but he worked on it too, just to acknowledge that Faruqi was not alone. In any case, I think Faruqi's attempt worked. And he may, in fact, be credited with our healthy, skeptical position about comparative religion today. So in a way, he was trying to achieve something else, but he succeeded in achieving something better, which is to show that you can always find these multiple ways of neutrality. The common view of Islam as a side, I guess I shouldn't elaborate this because I already did the idea. There is something that puzzles scholars of Islam who take the primary sources seriously. They wonder why it seems like the deck is stacked against them. There is no way that you get benefits from being, from having the precedent, except maybe when philosophers talk about how Muslims, given their limited contribution and understanding in any case, moved some Greek philosophy later to the able Latin hands that would take and, of course, reconsider some of these strange ideas that Muslims had, for example, reconciling Plato and Aristotle. Who would do that? That would be somebody who doesn't know how much Aristotle disagreed with Plato. You know, Jama' bayn al-Hakimayn and so on. Muslim philosophers were not as good historians as, of course, the modern historians do. But of course, to be honest too, and to be fair, a lot of modern European philosophers thought that medieval Christian philosophers were bad also. So there is some complexity there. But you can just see the frustration that you realize that there is nothing really you can do or say that would change this view. In some recent manifestations of scholarship in the humanities that address Islam, the old hope for global neutrality is renewed in the descriptive social science postures. Again, you know, that's good, no effort goes to waste, and we can always learn from local or foreign observers' views of any social or religious phenomenon, but the old limits persist. That is, the observer's global neutrality is only a hope and an indication of personal decency. We'll take the personal decency, but you know, in my legal training, good intentions are very hard to ascertain. But if there's no reason to assume that they don't exist, and there is some reason to assume that they exist, we'll assume, yeah, this person had good intention, that was good intention. But aside from you know, that personal decency and good intention, there isn't much there. So aside from being nothing but an indication of good intention, in fact, this assumption of neutrality it is also unnecessary. Why do you need it? I mean, do you only hear people who think they are, or who pretend to you that they're neutral? I don't need global neutrality to be useful, or authoritative, or anything else you might hope for in scholarship. Entertainment might come to mind. You don't need neutrality to be entertaining. You don't need neutrality to be authoritative. It's really unnecessary. What makes academic dialogue productive isn't claims of universal neutrality, but the possibility of understanding and effective communication, nothing more. And on the pragmatic level, what makes it academic is what we call academic due process. And that's the other side of what I'm talking about. So what is this academic due process? I didn't make up the term, by the way, and if you really want to read something about, there's a volume called, titled University Reform by Hans-Jörg Tiede, T-I-E-D-E, Oxford, published last year, which is about the history of the American Association for the University Professors. It actually just talks about the first 3 or 4 years. It shows how the struggle for academic freedom during World War I, because that's how AAUP started, was a big deal. And it's very hard, and maybe people who are interested always in going back to our time will see something like that. That in a political context that is afraid and not relaxed and not able to say, well, let's see what comes out. And, you know, maybe we won't listen to the academics at the end. Let them just talk. So it seems, you know, one of these patriotic seasons. You know, somebody jokes that in most countries there are 4 seasons. Right? There is there's winter, spring, and so on. But in this country, there are only 2 seasons, and they tend to be very long. Patriotic seasons and the regular season. Of now, under Bush, under Reagan, in the 60s, the McCarthy deal, World War II, and under Wilson, that time of the First World War was a time also of suspicion and fear. I mean, for God's sake, there was a whole constitutional amendment about the prohibition of alcohol, which one of its justifications was that the Germans were selling us alcohol so that they can take the money and buy weapons in our times. So the sense of alarm can be excessive, of course, here in particular. I mean, in other places too. So in this story, though, of academic due process, you can go back to this time, and that time, the beginning of World War I, at the time of World War I, the beginning of academic due process was only about 2 generations after the founding of the modern American university. Everybody, of course, will jump immediately and say, oh, Harvard is since the 1630s, and William Mary 1692 or 93. Well, that's true. That there are 9 schools before the Revolution, including the New Jersey College that became Princeton University, including UPenn, and there are also schools between the Revolution and the end of the Civil War. But the modern university that we have, the research university, is a product of the post-Civil War era. And that's the one that got regulated, and the sense of academic freedom comes from that. Because the previous schools, if you read about their history, were really interesting creatures. I mean, at Harvard, for example, you teach Greek or Latin for a little bit because you're waiting for a more permanent position in the clergy. It's a temporary thing. So most of the, even though there were attempts, of course, at making sure that people didn't abuse power and didn't just dismiss professors because they didn't agree with them, but of course you had to wait. And the world we have now is the regime really goes back to just about 100 years ago. Now, so it may be 100 years old, but from now on, one can be sure that some form of due process in the academy will always be with us. Maybe at least as long as the academy survive. It's not going to disappear. Some form will be there. No, so what it is really just an opportunity. The process calls for peers to judge us, just like we judge them. And then academic departments and colleges get to decide whether they want to support. It's all about patronage, right? The university gets to decide to patronize you or not patronize. And it's not necessarily an airtight system, it's not necessarily fair. I mean, there are tons of cases that we know, and that's why AAUP is still active too. Going back and wondering about the conditions of the dismissal of some people. But in any case, in practice, losing the pretension to global neutrality doesn't seem to affect this process. It's working despite that. We don't look for, so did this person get it right? And actually, that's even true in the sciences too. I know that surprises a lot of people, but that seems to be accepted finally, despite the rhetoric in the public. These are the hard sciences. This is a clear, because most good scientists realize that the room of interpretation is pretty significant in many of these researches. That, by the way, also when people say science, they mostly mean engineering and they mostly mean technology. They don't mean fundamental science or basic science. So this is what we have. Is it a better deal? In my view, yes. Is it a guarantee that it will always make you immune to any abuse? Of course not. There will always be abuses. I remember one of the vice chancellors at the University of California in Santa Barbara, where I am, telling some of the faculty members who were not on good terms with their department chairs. He said, well, you can't be on bad terms with this is like your dad. You just have to be on good terms with that. Not that they would let you stay, but that you'll get a hearing. So sometimes people change the conditions for the review before it even happens. But will you be guaranteed that when people write, have 6 or 7 or 8 random people writing for you, that anything could happen with that too? What I think is something to celebrate is that the monopoly on what is acceptable or what's not acceptable, which used to spring from orientation, from actual academic orientation, is very hard to generate today. There were fields, of course, that didn't have as many people, and that monopoly remained there. There would be people who would say, you know what, if you do what I don't like, if I don't get you in the PhD, I'll get you when you attempt to get tenure, I'll get you later when you want to get full professorship, and so on. So human beings are human beings. So these guarantees are not there. As I promised in the beginning, I guess I went too long, that I want to say about what I don't like, the so-called, what I call the epidemics. And I mentioned 3 of them, but let me focus maybe on just 2. The scholarship that aims only at negating conclusions without suggesting any alternatives. Scholarship of negation. And the second one is the obsession with establishing an accurate picture of the past, which leads to what I call the work of the anachronism police. So these 2 phenomena are not new, and I'm not the first one, of course, to talk about them, but I think they started to represent academics if they hadn't been already for a long time. I'll just say a couple of things about them, and I think I'll just sit down and we can have more of a relaxed discussion. So let me say something about the first one. Scholarship, negation. I'll say a few things. One, scholarship that aims only at negating without asserting may hide behind the example of Socrates. Socrates taught, as Baba Music put it in Socratic puzzles, that he knew very little. Socrates knew very little. But at least he knew that. He knew that he knew very little. While others knew very little, just like him, but they were not acknowledging that. They didn't know, maybe, that they knew only very little. That was Socrates' virtue. Now, even if we can hide behind this example, I mean, do we really need that many Socrates? Do you need multiple Socrates to teach the same lesson? We can't say anything about this because it's too complicated. I just can't personally believe that that's always true. There's something else going on, which is, lack of willingness to take responsibility or following a bad example that, again, we may have set for good reasons or good intentions that over time became unbearable. Second point about this, if it is still attractive to attack without asserting, ask why this is. There is nothing wrong with saying what you think. No one is in a position to do better than you unless they know more than you or are more organized or something like that. So it's not smarter to criticize and say nothing. We don't need to transfer the strategy of negative theology to humanities. Negative theology, of course, is when you can't really describe God. You don't know what just means. This is not unfair, not unjust. But that's a metaphysical entity. And yes, worldly phenomena sometimes are complicated, but they're not all that complicated. And they don't need that fear, I think. The third point, borrowing from my texts, the 11th century Persian jurist and theologian Juwayni had a famous saying, or dictum, لِكُلِّ طَلَبٍ مَطْلُوبٍ. If there is a search or research, there must be a conclusion that we're seeking to arrive at. This establishes a basic point. If you don't have a position to defend, you will, of course, always look smarter than others. But this is an illusion. You are, in fact, not better. Yours is the position of sophists, enjoyed among the youth in ancient Greece. They never seemed to lose because they had nothing to defend. Now, of course, people who know something about the dialogues know that they were caught and, in fact, attacked for making very specific mistakes, too. I mean, that was one of the tasks of the dialogue. So it's not that they got away with that. They wanted to look that way, but they couldn't. In fact, one ought to be willing to lose a fake advantage, such as this, in favor of the much simpler and naive position of stating what you think when one is committed to a position. And again, I don't mean to take away the rare cases or situations where people really get stuck. I mean, I get stuck. But if you suspend judgment, you have evidence for that. You have to show why there are conflicting considerations as opposed to finding the easy way out of tailoring words. A lot of it is tailoring words. And they don't educate anything. Tailored words don't educate anybody. I'll say something about the anachronism thing. I already, I guess, said the gist of it. But maybe this is stating the obvious. There is no such a thing as a present version of the past that is like the past. Right? Old ideas are recovered and studied today because we think them today. We think them, not about them. We think the old ideas again when we talk about them. There is no contemporary language that is capable of recovering the past. If you discover an aspect of words of known history, whether again state, citizenship, secular, religious, utility, etc., that show that their present projection on the past is anachronistic, be aware that other words you use also have a history. Your language is a language of the present. Your comprehension is a comprehension of the present. Your audience's comprehension is a comprehension of the present. So pointing to anachronism must make an intelligible point and not pretend to come from a God instructing a mortal to speak within their limited scope or capacity. There are no gods in history or even religious studies department like mine. A lot of them, of course, have historical training too. I'll train that as historian. This is not a polemical point. I genuinely also realize the difficulty of talking about the past. And sometimes, of course, some of us who don't think that the past is past make mistakes because we think that there is a degree of continuity, that especially in a moment like this when it seems like we can go in any direction, there is no point in asserting that the project of modernity must have led to something specific after its journey. I mean, one thing I mentioned Harvey Mansfield, I'll mention him again. One thing that he always taught us, the only meaningful sense for progress is that you can't go backward. That is true. You can't go backward. You can't go back and relive the 15th century. But the other sense of progress, the gratuitous, kind of generous sense of progress, that says, no, yeah, we're going in a certain kind of trajectory. There's no reason this is less presumptuous than those who say, well, we'll go back to the past and create hybrids, like the ISIS session, for example, showed. That idea of hybrid, of course, is very old, from the beginning of the 20th century. If when you study modern Middle Eastern laws, it's all about hybridity, definitely. So I have 2 minutes, so let me conclude. I think that meaningful defenses of neutrality are history. I like that. That means that we have an opportunity, as I said, I found that in this American Academy of Religion annual meeting, that people can be talking about different things. And you can see that in sessions that are attended by 10, 15 people who all know one thing, they don't need to impress anybody else. They're serious. So people are talking about rabbinic literature, they're not trying to get anybody who's interested in Christianity to think something about Christianity, although they read Christian sources, of course. I mean, the fun thing about this is that the essence of the good part about comparison is that it can open up and you can see the picture from different sides. That is there. That's not going to go away. It depends on your languages. It depends on how expansive in your approach is. But it is that normative side of comparison that is beginning to be, I think we should carry it further and be optimistic and say, we will say what we think without that fear that because we're scholars we can't get it wrong. Talk like a layperson. To be like a layperson maybe in terms of the sense of security. Sometimes lay people, of course, have too much security, but you won't have that. And also you'll be definitely unlike a layperson in that you have all these tools. With this, I conclude, and I would like to definitely get into a discussion about any of these points. Thanks.